Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. I'm Professor Joy Carter, Vice-Chancellor of the University of Winchester, and it's my pleasure to welcome you all here today. We're going to reveal to you the latest important findings in the search for King Alfred the Great. First of all, a special welcome to our local MP, Steve Brine, sitting down there. Steve's a great supporter of the university and the local community. Steve, it's really good to have you with us here today. Ladies and gentlemen, the University of Winchester is an institution with a very long history. We've been delivering high-quality higher education right here in this city since 1840. Hyde 900 is an inspirational and very active community group working here in the community. Together, utilising the expertise of our archaeology department, we have searched for King Alfred's final resting place. King Alfred's significance in the history of this country cannot be underestimated. He was best known for defending Wessex against the Viking invaders. He also laid the foundations for a unified English nation. Perhaps above all, he was passionate about education and about learning. And his story is inextricably linked with that of the city of Winchester. Now, many have tried to find his final resting place without success. Today, we share with you the roller coaster ride of the last few months of this exciting investigation. But where did the journey begin? For us, it began with the exhumation of the unmarked grave, just a few metres from this very hall. But it ended with a much more surprising discovery. And what we're going to reveal to you today could lead to something even bigger. Let me introduce the members of the panel who will be explaining more about the findings. We have Rosemary Burns and Edward Fennell, trustees of Hyde 900. Please raise your hands, Rosemary and Edward. They've never wavered in their commitment to reveal the secrets of this area. Dr. Katie Tucker is a researcher in human osteology at the University of Winchester. She's carried out work on the bones. And sitting next to me here, Professor Barbara York is Professor Emerita of Early Medieval History at the University of Winchester. And she's an expert on King Alfred and the period in question. I do have to ask you at this point, please not to communicate this story before the 1 p.m. embargo is lifted. And supporting information will be available on our website. And now it's my pleasure to hand over to our panel. And first of all, I'd like to invite Professor Barbara York.
Thank you. It will become apparent why I'm not just talking about King Alfred, but also about his son, Edward. And I do urge you all to keep in your minds that this is not just about Alfred, in spite of all these posters. It's about other members of the royal family as well, but particularly, possibly, Edward. So I'm just going to very quickly summarise some of the main points of historical interest in these two reigns. Now, King Alfred, of course, is the best-known Anglo-Saxon king, and that's really because he had a contemporary biography. And that's meant in later periods, especially in the 18th and 19th centuries, when there was a great interest in the Anglo-Saxon origins of England, that it was Alfred that people went for, simply because more was known about him. And the great statue of Alfred in Winchester that you see on our posters was the result of international celebrations in Winchester in 1901 that reflect that sort of interest. Now, there's lots of interesting things one could say about Alfred, but I only have a couple of minutes. So I'm going to quickly cut to the chase and say that what's really put him on the map is the fact that he was a king who was able to defeat the Vikings. Those ferocious fighters who received so much attention, well, there were Anglo-Saxon kings in Wessex who were able to stop them, and Alfred was one of these. First in a major outright pitched battle in 878, and then by erecting a series of fortresses to make a sort of fortress Wessex, so they couldn't get back in. Winchester was one of those fortresses, a refortified Roman town. Now, to do these types of things, and these fortresses were manned by garrisons, it required a huge amount of manpower. It required a lot more commitment by his subjects. And so he had to find various ways to keep them fighting the Vikings. And one of the ways he did this was to stress the difference of the Anglo-Saxons from the Vikings. A different religion, but above all, a different language. And he promoted the use of English as a learned language, and even took part in some translations of key works from Latin into English himself. An absolutely amazing thing for a warrior king to do. Now, what Alfred began, his son Edward completed. And he went a long way to producing the England that we know, because Alfred only ruled the area of Wessex, which is England south of the Thames. Edward extended control up to the River Humber. And this map, although small, may help you with that. The bright pink at the bottom is Wessex. The pale pink is the West Midland, the sort of free area that worked with Alfred and Edward. And then the blue is the areas that have been occupied by the Vikings. And you can see on the map Edward working his way up, using the fortresses which Alfred had introduced in an offensive way to take land from the Vikings. And another important point here is that this area had never been ruled by the West Saxon kings. He's taking it over for the first time. And it was Edward who founded the big church known as the New Minster, in which Alfred, Alfred's wife Alswith, Edward himself, and other members of the family were buried. And on this map here, and I'm sorry it's so tiny, but right in the middle of town, you may be able to see two buildings next to each other. The more southerly of these is the Old Minster, the Winchester Cathedral of the Anglo-Saxon period, which is just to the north of our current Norman Cathedral. And north of the Old Minster is this new burial church for the dynasty of Alfred, New Minster. And as you see, it's quite a cramped space in the middle of Winchester. And so in 1110, the decision was taken to move out here to Hyde, which you can see marked on the map, Hyde Moors, an estate already owned by New Minster. And at this time, the bodies of Alfred, Edward, and Alswith, and presumably other members of the royal house, were taken out and given an honoured place of burial in the east end of the church, just in front of the high altar. And that's where my part of the story ends.
I'd now like to invite Rosemary Burns, who's a trustee of Hyde 900, to continue the story.
Hello, everybody. You'll want to know, in fact, you'll be intrigued to know all about Hyde 900. It's a registered charity. It was established in 2006, principally in order to commemorate, 5 years later in 2010, the 900th anniversary of the foundation of Hyde Abbey, which you've just heard about from Barbara. Here is a picture taken from the glass engraving, which you might care to see if you stroll down towards Hyde Abbey Garden later. You'll see this at the entrance to it. This was to commemorate, as I say, the establishment of the Abbey and the translation there from the New Minster of the Royal House of Wessex. I should also tell you about St Bartholomew's Church. Again, you can see it if you stroll down the road. It's just round the corner and down into King Alfred Place. It was the Abbey's lay church and is its spiritual successor. At a church fete held in the summer of 2010, it was announced by Hyde 900 and the rector of St Bartholomew's, Cliff Bannister, who sits in front of me, that the time had come to investigate the mystery of Hyde Abbey, in particular to try and identify the contents of an unmarked grave outside the east window of the church. Here is a panoramic view of St Bartholomew's coming round to the east end in the darkness under the yew tree. Next, a brief word about the unmarked grave. It was in the Victorian times that a self-styled romantic antiquarian called John Mellor obtained permission to excavate the site of Hyde Abbey's great church. This was in 1866 to 1867. He thought that he'd found the bones of the Royal House of Wessex, and he sold the collection for 10 bob to the then rector of St Bartholomew's Church, the Reverend William Williams. That rector, realising the potential significance of these bones, had them interred in the grave at the east end of the church, unmarked, save for a simple cross. Now, coming back to Hyde 900, in 2010, a working committee was set up under the title of the Grave Investigation Group, or GIG, as it was known. It had frequent meetings in the Hyde Tavern, and furtive meetings, I may say, and a vast amount of research produced in due course an application which was drafted for a faculty or permission from the Diocesan Chancellor to investigate the contents of the unmarked grave. It was slow progress until in early autumn 2011, news surfaced about developments in Leicester in relation to the search for the bones of King Richard III. And at the beginning of February, the full story of Richard III broke. This gave rise to a front-page article in the Times, and here you have a picture of just the beginning of that article by Tom Whipple, entitled Alfred the Great Next in Line to be Dug Up, and featuring the Unmarked Grave Project, with background material on Hyde, the Abbey, and the story of Alfred. The media furore that followed prompted concerns amongst the diocesan authorities, and in particular the Chancellor of the diocese, about the security of the unmarked grave. It was thought that anyone at the dead of night could come with a shovel and go digging. So this resulted in an emergency permission being granted to exhume the remains from the grave in order to take them to a place of safety. At this stage, Hyde 900 secured the agreement of a BBC production team to film the project, and some of them are here today, we're glad to say. They also invited a team from the archaeology department of the University of Winchester to carry out the work of exhuming the remains and keeping them in storage until the full faculty was granted by the Chancellor to have them scientifically examined, which eventually it was. It was on a ferociously cold day in March of last year that we gathered at the unmarked grave to embark on the exhumation. This began with the prayers led by the Bishop of Basingstoke, and you can see him here with Cliff Bannister and with the Reverend Paul Townsend from St Peter's Catholic Church along the road. The exhumation got underway, and Dr. Katie Tucker was the osteoarchaeologist instructed to lead the team. I'm now going to ask you to look at a clip from the documentary film which has been made about this investigation, and the first clip will show the day of the exhumation.
A cold morning in March 2013. At St Bartholomew's Church in Winchester, the rector is preparing for an unusual day. Gathering here is a team of local historians, archaeologists, and a bishop.
May God's peace be in our hearts. May God's peace be with us in our homes.
This group is hoping to resolve a long-standing mystery about this unmarked grave in their local parish church. some, what these archaeologists are doing may seem like sacrilege. But this could be the culmination of an incredible story that began over 1,000 years ago.
I can see os coxa, there's a humerus down there, there's a mandible, tibia, femora.
For 150 years, it's been claimed that this unmarked grave contains the remains of one of England's greatest kings, the man who laid the foundations of the English nation, Alfred the Great.
Well, that was extraordinary.
Oh, wow.
Very, very moving indeed.
No one knows for sure where Alfred the Great's remains lie buried. So why does the team believe that these might be his bones? And why would they be mixed together with other skeletons in this unmarked grave? To answer these questions, I'm going to explore the story of Alfred's life and death. I'll team up with specialists to test the bones. And we'll discover how they came to be buried in the graveyard of this modest parish church, and whether they really are the remains of King Alfred the Great. This is an extraordinary historical mystery concerning a great Anglo-Saxon king. If it hadn't been for Alfred, we would probably have a different national identity. We might even speak a different language. Alfred the Great was a hugely significant leader in our history, so it's important that we find out the truth about the remains exhumed from the unmarked grave. And if they do turn out to be those of Alfred, then they can be reburied with all the dignity they deserve, well over 1,000 years after his death.
Now, a second clip to show you the results of Katie's preliminary examinations.
In Winchester, Dr. Katie Tucker has finally assembled all the bones found in the unmarked grave. I must admit, my first reaction is I'm amazed by how much is here. It's a lot of bones from the individuals.
Well, we have 5 skulls, you can see here, and then we have the remains of 6 post-cranial skeletons, so the rest of the skeleton that isn't the skull.
Is it both sexes represented here?
Yes, we do have males and females. This individual is definitely a female. Mm-hmm. You can see the pelvis is very, very wide, and of course they would generally tend to be smaller than males.
So it's one woman definitely,
Yeah.
and then the likelihood that's 5 males.
We have a definite male here.
Mm-hmm.
This one, probably a male, and this individual is also probably a male.
So, based on that, this could be Alfred.
That could be, that could be.
That could be, and that's, and this one,
That
this one
could be.
definitely no.
That one's definitely
Right.
female, yes.
And when you look at these skeletons, what story do they tell about the kind of lives lived by the people?
For such a small number of individuals, they've got a lot going on in terms of disease. You can see the vertebrae. You can see they're all fused together into one lump. And this is because all the ligaments that attach all the vertebrae together and the tendons, they've all turned to bone, they've all ossified.
Right.
So it would have left the individual with very, very limited movement.
Surely that makes it unlikely that this would be Alfred.
There are historical reports that Alfred had some form of chronic health problem. It suggested maybe it was Crohn's disease, but that you probably would not be able to see that in the skeleton.
So in terms of the search for Alfred and his relatives, what is next?
Well, the next stage is to take some samples for radiocarbon dating, so actually be able to work out the age of the bones from bone samples.
I'm now going to hand over to Dr. Katie Tucker.
Okay, this is the unmarked grave at the east end of St Bartholomew's Church, as it has been since the reburial of the remains that Mellor excavated. You can see with the simple stone slab, with no inscription and just an engraved cross. The first part of the excavation involved the removal of that slab, and that revealed that the grave was, we believed, completely full of soil. This we started to excavate by hand until a few inches under the slab we uncovered 2 stone slabs, concreted into place underneath 3 courses of brick. Shining a torch through the gap between the slabs, we could see that the grave was almost completely empty of soil, with human remains visible at the base. The slabs were so firmly concreted in place, it was only possible to remove one of them without causing serious damage to the brick-built vault and a possible collapse onto the remains within. Once that slab had been removed, the remains became visible. You can see that at the east end of the vault were smaller bones of the skeleton, such as vertebrae, ribs and hand and foot bones, with the long bones concentrated in the centre and the 5 crania or skulls at the west end. The remains were carefully lifted, boxed and taken back to the university for analysis. The 5 crania were assigned numbers, as can be seen in this photograph, and it's also possible to see that they are the same crania as were photographed in the 19th century, demonstrated that the remains excavated by us were the same ones excavated by Mellor and reburied in the unmarked grave at the request of William Williams. An analysis of the other remains, based on size, morphology and coloration of the bones, demonstrated the presence of 6 postcranial individuals. It was possible to match all 5 of the crania to one of these individuals, giving a minimum number of 6 individuals. And these comprised an adult female of 26 to 35 years of age at death, a possible male of over 36 years of age, a male of 36 to 45 years of age, a possible male of 36 to 45 years of age, and 2 adults who were largely incomplete, but based on the size and robusticity of the long bones were also probably male. The remains showed evidence for common pathological conditions such as arthritis and dental disease, but there was also evidence for a number of rarer conditions amongst the individuals. And these included ankylosing spondylitis and DISH, which is diffuse idiopathic skeletal hyperostosis. And these are both conditions which lead to fusion of the spine and restricted movement. There was Paget's disease, which causes thickening and weakening of the bone, and hypertrophic osteoarthropathy, which is characterised by thick new deposits of bone and may be related to a chronic gastrointestinal, so gut, or pulmonary lung condition. The next stage of the scientific analysis was radiocarbon dating of the remains, which was carried out by Professor Tom Hyam at the Oxford Radiocarbon Accelerator Unit. Small samples of bone from all 5 of the crania and a sample from each of the postcranial remains were removed for dating in the laboratory at Oxford. The radiocarbon dates can be seen here, given to 95.4% confidence rate. The postcranial remains are shown adjacent to the crania that were osteologically assessed as belonging to them. It can be seen that individual 5 and crania C are the earliest remains from the assemblage, and are likely to be amongst the earliest burials at the newly founded Hyde Abbey. The other remains date to the 13th to 15th centuries, during the period of the Abbey's existence. However, it can be clearly seen that, although the remains are very interesting, especially in view of the unusual pathological conditions recorded amongst such a small assemblage, the dates indicate that none of the individuals could be members of the Royal House of Wessex.
Back to me. You might have thought that we were incredibly disappointed, and indeed we were. However, during the course of her research, and as part of her commitment to due diligence, Katie decided to explore with the Winchester Museum Service what material they held from a community excavation which took place on the Hyde Abbey site in 1995 to 1999. And here you see a picture of the area they excavated on the site at Hyde Abbey Garden, as it now is. This was the first proper excavation of the site on a useful scale. It confirmed that the antiquarian diggings carried out in the 19th century, both that of John Mellor and also another instigated by the then Mayor of Winchester, Alfred Bowker, in 1897 to 1899, had focused on the high altar in the area where the most prestigious burials would have been placed. The community excavation confirmed the silence of the historical record concerning any pre-Abbey cemetery at the site, so there would have been no burials of Anglo-Saxon bones before AD 1110, when the Abbey was founded. A principal purpose of the excavation was to find the footprint of the Abbey buildings, of which Hyde Gate is really one of the few remaining. And it was part of a wider community archaeological programme. Artifacts, including bones, were collected, recorded and stored in the Winchester Museum Service store. There was said to have been found a fragment of a pelvic bone, initially thought to have been of interest. However, it was examined and found to be a female and of a later date. There were apparently no other findings of relevance or relevant bones at the conclusion of the excavation. However, Katie's inquiry of the museum curator, Helen Rees, in September last year, revealed that there were 2 boxes of bones at the museum's storage facility, which had been identified as human, but not until some years after the excavation had ended, by which time there was no funding available to carry out any examination of those bones. Helen kindly gave permission for the 2 boxes, and we're very grateful to Helen Rees, by the way, I should say that at this stage. She gave permission for the 2 boxes to be retrieved from the museum store and taken to the university lab, where Katie opened them. Here is a selection of what she found. She started to examine the contents. She found 5 contexts of interest, and it was decided to take them back up to Tom Hyam at Oxford University to have the samples carbon dated. And I'm going to hand back to Katie to tell you what she discovered.
Right, this plan shows the east end of Hyde Abbey Church as excavated in 1997 to 1999. The area of the high altar and the antiquarian diggings can be seen here, with 3 separate pits, which correspond to those dug by the prisoners in the 18th century, by Mellor in 1866 to 7, and by Bowker in maybe 1900 to 1901. There were 2 boxes of human bone identified sometime after the end of the 99 excavations, but the majority of these came from the area to the area of the medieval cemetery to the south of the church, and were therefore of no relevance in the present investigation. However, there were a small number of areas that were either at the site of the high altar or in its immediate vicinity where human bone was also found, and this was subjected to a more detailed analysis and sampled for radiocarbon dating by Professor Tom Hyam. The first of these was parts of an adult female skull and some ribs and vertebrae that were found in a pit to the north of the east end of the church. The radiocarbon dates for these remains were 11th to 12th century, so again, one of the earliest burials at the newly founded Hyde Abbey, but not early enough to be Royal House of Wessex. The second was an adult humerus, upper arm bone, that was found in 2 pieces, one in the earliest of the antiquarian pits and the other slightly to the west of the high altar. This was dated to the 14th to 15th centuries. The third was parts of an adult male cranium and a number of long bones from a large adult male, found in a pit in the ambulatory to the south of the east end of the church. And these were dated to the late 13th to 14th centuries. The final piece of bone was part of an adult male pelvis found in the backfill of the latest of the antiquarian pits at the site of the high altar. And I believe there's a video clip that should be shown now.
Have you had these bones dated?
Yes, we've sent a small fragment of bone from each of the groups of bone off, and we're now just waiting for Tom Hyam. He's abroad at the moment, but he's hopefully got the results for us, and he's going to join us on the screen.
conjure him up.
Okay. Hi, Tom.
Hi, Tom.
Hi, Katie. Hi, Neil. How are you?
We're well.
Yeah, pretty good.
We've got some news. We've got 5 new dates.
Yeah.
3 of them fall once again into the 1300s period, so they're consistent with the previous batch. There's one which is a little bit older than that, but there's the 5th one, which is this piece of male pelvis. It's older than anything we've actually done before, and it's actually falling into the late part of the 800s and into the 900s.
No,
So
really?
it's
Fantastic.
very, very old indeed.
You're joking. So it's right from the right time for Alfred and family.
It's bang on the money.
That's fantastic, Tom.
Great stuff.
Yeah, that's great news. Thank you very much.
Pleasure. Bye for now.
Bye, Tom. Well, what do you make of that?
That is unexpected, I would say, but yeah, very good news. Yeah.
I was sceptical. What does it mean if we add it up, what we've got here? It's this bone here,
Yeah,
isn't it?
it's the part of the male pelvis. Well, the part of the pelvis that we have, it's from a male, from an adult male, in their 40s. So that would tie in quite well with either Alfred or his son Edward the Elder. And basically, as far as we know from the chronicles and from the records, the only individuals close to the site of the high altar who are of the right age when they died and the right date when they died would either be Alfred or Edward.
So in terms of circumstantial evidence, this is pretty good. And at the distance that we're reaching back into time to find the pelvis of a 40-something man who died around 900-ish in that location by the high altar in Hyde Abbey, the likelihood is, or the strong possibility
yes,
is...
there's a good chance, I would say, because just from the records, who else could it be?
What more would you need then, in a court of law, I suppose, to say conclusively?
Well, really, because we only have that one piece, there really isn't much else we can do from that. We haven't got anybody else we could compare it with, so from that piece of bone, there isn't really anything else that we could do. However, there is the possibility of going back to the site to re-excavate.
So more of Alfred or his son, or both, could be there still?
Yeah, there's the potential that in areas that were not excavated in the 90s, there may still be fragments of bone to be found.
But imagine, I mean, even given all of that, the possibility as we stand here is that, you know, the life and the legend of Alfred the Great comes down to this enigmatic fragment of bone.
Yeah, it's quite amazing, really, yeah. Okay, so the radiocarbon date obtained from this bone was 895 to 1017. So this places it very firmly within the Saxon period, much earlier than the date of the founding of Hyde Abbey. And the excavations of Hyde Abbey in the 1990s, plus the documentary evidence, indicate the land on which the abbey was built was largely uninhabited at the time that it was built, and there was no evidence for any burials on the site before the abbey. Therefore, this piece of pelvis, which comes from an adult male of between 26 to 45 years of age and is of the correct date, is likely to belong to one of the members of the Royal House of Wessex. The 3 candidates are Alfred, who died in 899, Edward, who died in 924, and Ethelweard, a brother of Edward. The latter is thought to have been in his late 30s or 40s when he died, and the former were both around 50. Slightly older than the osteological age of the bone, but this is not a problem as current osteological ageing methods tend to underage older adults. The archaeological and documentary evidence would also suggest that it is unlikely to be Ethelweard, as his coffin was not at the site of the high altar, with the conclusion that the bone is likely to belong to either Edward the Elder or Alfred the Great.
I'd like now to introduce our final panel member, Edward Fennell, who was the founder and trustee of Hyde 900.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Let me say immediately, on behalf of Hyde 900, that we are delighted by the results that we have had so far in our investigation of the legacy of Hyde Abbey, and in particular, what happened to the bones of King Alfred the Great and other members of the Royal House of Wessex. We are enormously grateful to Dr. Katie Tucker and all her colleagues at the university for bringing us to this point. But as you gathered, this is not a Richard III situation. We know exactly where King Alfred was buried. There is no dispute about that. It was in Hyde Abbey. The challenge we faced was to find Alfred's bones and those of his family amongst their neighbours in death, the many other bones which were laid to rest on that site. The difference being, of course, that they would have been buried there at least 200 years later, after Alfred had died. Even so, when Hyde 900 was launched just around the corner from here in St. Bartholomew's Church in 2006, we could have never have guessed that we would end up, 8 years later, opening the unmarked grave. That was not our aim, nor our purpose, nor our focus. In those days, we had other things to get on with. But as in all matters historical, one thing leads to another. And solving the mystery of who was in the unmarked grave grew in us as a vital part of the history of Hyde. We're delighted with those results. We now have solved that. But then, thanks to Katie Tucker, we were led on from investigating the unmarked grave to finding the pelvis, which came originally from Newminster. As you've heard, that pelvis meets the conditions of age and location for either Alfred or Edward. And that discovery, what I call the power pelvis, will now lead on to other developments. Above all, that bone, the fact that that bone originally came from the Newminster site, has now been found and identified for the first time in Hyde. That suggests to us there could well be other Newminster bones out there, scattered about or deliberately buried, in parts of the site where a full excavation might not yet have taken place. So there are now interesting questions about what could happen next. As I mentioned in the final section of the film, which you'll be seeing on Tuesday, there may be a case for further investigation of the site and also perhaps further analysis of the power pelvis, the seat of power of the Royal House of Wessex, to see if there is anything further that it might reveal. Certainly, we view with considerable interest the possibility of further selective excavation on the ground, and we are grateful to the University of Winchester for their generous offer of financial support for that. We also welcome Winchester City Council's willingness to discuss with us what might be feasible. But there are, of course, a number of other key interested parties here who must be involved in this discussion, including notably the local residents and the Friends of Hyde Abbey Garden, who look after the site. What is most important, perhaps, is there's now a lot of interest in the site amongst the general public as well as academics. And interest in the site sparks interest in Alfred the Great and the Royal House of Wessex. In fact, Alfred the Great and Winchester go together in the same way as Shakespeare and Stratford. Neither lived their whole lives in their respective cities, but these cities provide a focus for understanding their achievements and their legacy. So we hope that this venture will spark further action both to commemorate Alfred as a unique political, military and cultural leader, and to interpret and explain more fully why his impact and that of Edward, his son, was so seminal and so significant in English history. At a time when the nature and future of the United Kingdom is being put under scrutiny by our friends north of the border, this is a timely opportunity to learn from the past and understand more, as the film puts it, about the making of England. Thanks very much.
Winchester University is a Guild HE institution and a Cathedrals Group institution, and we're very proud to be able to showcase to you such significant research and knowledge exchange. It's my pleasure to pay tribute to all those involved, and especially, of course, to Hyde 900 and to archaeologists at our own university. We believe very strongly that today is a historic moment in the quest to unravel the mystery of King Alfred the Great. Ladies and gentlemen, I'd now like to invite questions, if there are any, which our panel members will be happy to answer. Yes, it's a question for Dr. Tucker. Sorry, may I ask you to, when you ask a question, give your name and say where you're from?
Hello, my name is... Hello, my name is Rosemary Clarkson, and I'm a resident who just down the road here. Dr. Tucker, is it possible to extract DNA from that pelvic bone? And if so, would you be able to compare it to the bones of, I think, is it Alfred's daughter or granddaughter who's buried in Germany?
I think there's a good chance of extracting DNA. When I was talking to Professor Tom Hyam about the radiocarbon samples, his opinion was that the preservation of the organic component of the bone was very, very good, which is how we were able to get a very good radiocarbon date. And it's the same type of material that you're looking at when it comes to the ancient DNA in the bone. So I think there's a chance that we could get DNA from the bone. Comparing it with, I think it's Alfred's granddaughter, who's in Magdeburg in Germany, they did try and get ancient DNA from her remains, but were unable to. The remains were not sufficiently well preserved. So we would need to find somebody else to compare them with if we were able to get a viable sample from our piece of pelvis.
Okay, thank you.
Nick Collins from the Daily Telegraph. Nick Collins from the Daily Telegraph. With Richard III, they were able, I think, to find somebody who might have been a living sort of ancestor. Is there any prospect of that, or is he just too old to realistic? For that to be possible.
Well, we've had quite a number of individuals who've actually been contacting us, sending us their family trees, saying that they are actually descendants of Alfred. There's the potential that may be worth pursuing, but it is a very long way to try and go back. We're talking an extra kind of 500 years further back than with Richard III. So I think there's always going to be more of a difficulty in trying to track down a descendant.
The lady further back first, please.
Hello, Maeve Kennedy from The Guardian with a terrible cold, sorry. Presumably you think it might be Edward rather than Alfred because the Alfred dates are only barely within the radiocarbon range. And also, what happens now to the bones from the unmarked grave? Do they go back into it again?
Okay, we've got two questions there. Katie, do you want to try and answer the first one?
Yes,
And then
I'll try and answer
perhaps
the
I'll
first.
pass to Hyde 900 to try the second bit of the question.
Well, the range does cover the death date of Alfred and Edward equally well, I would say. So it's likely to be one of them. I wouldn't like to say which one of them. And that probably answers that part of the question.
Can I ask Hyde 900 to answer the second part?
The terms of the faculty granted by the Chancellor of the Diocese provide that once all useful scientific examination has been conducted on the bones from the unmarked grave, we are to put forward proposals for the reinterment of those remains. We haven't yet decided really whether possibly there might be further scientific examination, in which case we have to go back to the Chancellor to ask him for permission. And because of the interesting pathologies, it may be that Katie, it's too early to say, basically, but we will be putting forward proposals to the Chancellor for the reinterment of the remains very shortly.
Okay, thank you. The gentleman just here, the one in the front first, and then the one behind.
Hi, Ben Spencer from the Daily Mail. This excavation where you found the pelvis, 1999, I think you said. Why is it only now that that bone has been carbon dated, and what do you think's happened to the rest of it? I mean, why is it just a pelvis? Is that because it was moved or because there was a particularly violent death? Can you just expand on that?
Okay, the first part of the question, the excavations did actually identify another piece of human bone at the time, which was a part of a female pelvis, which they had radiocarbon dated at the time of the excavation. It came out was a much later date. It was post-medieval in date. I think it was 17th, 18th century in date. And once that had happened, and also because the other human bone was only identified sometime later. It wasn't really thought a good use of funding, which wasn't really available anyway, to date any other pieces of bone, because the date had come back previously as being far too late. So it wasn't expected that there would be anything that was the right date. And this other human bone wasn't identified at the time, right at the time of the excavation anyway.
So in that case, what made you think to go back and have another look at it?
Well, I'd known about the community excavations, and I thought there was only that piece of female pelvis that had been dated to post-medieval period. So it was only with talking to Helen Rees from the museum, she actually told me that there was this other material which had only been identified some time after the excavation. So I thought it was worth pursuing just to see what there was and where exactly it came from on the site, and whether there was anything that was in a location that would suggest it would be worth investigating further.
Thank you. I think Edward's got something to add.
If I just add something to that. Because of time constraints today, we haven't unfortunately been able to explain to you what happened on the Hyde Abbey site between 1110 and 1866. It's an extraordinary story. You're going to have to wait till Tuesday, because the TV documentary explains all of that very, very well indeed. And once you understand the history of the site, you can then start to understand why this almost at random, this particular bone surfaced did. Just to cut a very long story short, almost certainly the royal graves were found in 1788 when they were building a prison on the site. The graves were destroyed, the bones were then thrown about as they described, and reburied hither and thither. That's why finding a random bone is not surprising. They were thrown around over a significant part of that site. We just, in a sense, struck lucky in finding one of them.
Okay, thank you. Gentleman behind you, has that answered your question? Or
no. It's okay. So Tom Whipple, The Times. Just following up on the power pelvis, could you give us... The seat of power, sorry. Could you give us some more information about how it was stored in the museum for all this time, just sort of sitting around? And also, what's going to happen to it next? I mean, I know there are these sort of chests of bones in the Abbey that contain other Saxons. Are there plans for that? Or?
Edward, would you like to say something
no,
first?
Really
No? Katie.
Katie.
Okay.
Well, the second part of the question, we can't comment on the work that's going on in the cathedral. It's really up to them to comment on what they're doing. And the first part, sorry, can you just remind me of your first part of your question again?
Just how it was kept.
Oh, how it's kept. It was stored in the museum store there's hundreds of sites, material from hundreds of sites stored in the museum store. So it was accessible to researchers. It was never hidden away or anything, as people have suggested. It was always available to researchers. It was just I was probably the first researcher since a few years after the end of the excavation who actually wanted to look at it. So, and then it was Helen who very kindly made it available to me to look at. So it was never hidden away, it was always accessible.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, David Derbyshire, a couple of questions. Can you just describe the pelvis, how large it is, which bit of the pelvis you've got? Secondly, how confident are you that the security at the museum was good, that this is the piece that came out of the ground at that time? And thirdly, sorry, 3 questions. Who are the 6 skeletons buried at the back of Father Cliff's church?
Okay.
Sorry, before you answer, Katie, could you just say where you're from? Freelance. Okay, thank you.
Is it possible to get my slide back up showing the pelvis? Because that would probably be the easiest way of doing it. Okay, right. Anybody want to demonstrate? Who wants to be a human skeleton? Well, yeah, I'll do.
Identification.
Okay.
Mark. Yes.
Yeah. Well, it's the right-hand side of the pelvis. So you can see on the left side of that photo is where the hip joint is, so where the femur goes into the pelvis. We're missing kind of the front part of the pelvis and part of the kind of top part, which would be like this part here. But it's relatively complete, kind of right Oscoxa, you would call it, technical terms. Size, well, it's human-sized. It's it's the normal size you'd expect from a kind of normal-sized human.
Do you want to illustrate that with your
well,
sort of
it's
something
kind
like
of
that?
Like that size, maybe. I haven't measured it, no, because I wouldn't measure it because there's nothing complete to measure on it.
Can you suggest, is it sort of, a quarter of a total human hip or a half of one, or like,
Well, it's probably 3/4 of that side of the pelvis and maybe a third of a complete pelvis, a quarter to a third of a complete pelvis. Because the complete pelvis, you're also talking obviously about the other side and the sacrum as well, so which we don't have. Second part of the question was, how do we know that it's definitely the same one that was excavated? There's markings here. This was marked by, I'm guessing, volunteers. Helen? Probably. Oh, possibly Helen herself. Which demonstrates the site code and the context number of where this bone actually came from. That was done shortly after the excavation. It was also it was bagged up in a bag, labelled. It was in a box, labelled with the site. There's no reason to suspect that it had been mixed up with something else, because that would have been labelled pretty soon after the excavation had ended. So, I mean, I'm pretty confident that, well, I'm completely sure that is the piece of bone that came out of that context. It can't be anything else. There's no reason to suggest it would be anything else. And part 3, you'll have to remind me again. Oh, who were the other 6? Okay. Well, we do... Sorry, I'll sit down again. We do know that Mellor did some digging in the cemetery, in the medieval cemetery to the south of the east end of the church, because the community excavations demonstrated that a number of the graves in that area kind of been rifled. Bones hadn't necessarily been removed, but someone had been digging around in the graves. There's also a possibility of some graves further back in the church having been excavated by Mellor as well. So it's possible some of these individuals came from within the church and some of them came from the cemetery. The cemetery was not really re-excavated. They just demonstrated that some of the graves had been reopened, but they didn't re-excavate the graves in the 1990s. So we don't know if any of them were completely empty. So we can't say for definite where these individuals came from. But they came from Hyde Abbey, either within the church or within the cemetery.
Okay, thank you very much. The time is going on now, and I'm afraid I have to close down the questions, but please bear with me. A few more final announcements. First of all, of course, importantly, to thank you all for being with us, and to thank members of the panel and others, experts, for being here. The members of the panel and other spokespeople involved in the project are available for interview now, if anybody would like to take advantage of that. Can I ask the press officers please to stand up? And we ask all journalists who wish to have an interview to book a time with a press officer and make themselves known. So the press officers have their hands up towards the back there. Also, I'd like to invite you to make use of the locations that are so integral to this exciting story: the unmarked grave, Hyde Abbey Gardens, and the church itself, all very much in this location. And importantly and finally, further refreshments are available in the Hyde Tavern pub nearby. Thank you.